The wind howled like a wounded beast across the open prairie, driving sheets of snow sideways until the world disappeared into a white blur. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the cold had already seeped into her bones. Her boots crunched over the frozen ground, the sound muffled by the storm's relentless roar. Every step felt heavier, every breath sharper. She had been walking for what felt like hours, guided only by the faint glimmer of light far in the distance. The satchel hanging from her shoulder was pitifully light, a change of clothes, a worn Bible, and a single photograph tucked into its depths. She kept one gloved hand pressed against it, as if the contents could keep her alive. The storm stung her cheeks, turning them raw. If she stopped now, she knew she'd never get up again. Somewhere in the snow-choked horizon, she thought she saw the shape of a house. By the time she reached the wooden porch, her legs were trembling so badly she nearly collapsed. The wind rattled the windows, and snow clung to her hair and lashes. She lifted a frozen hand to knock on the door, the sound barely audible over the gale. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the latch clicked and the door opened just wide enough to reveal a tall figure, shadowed by the flicker of firelight inside. James Carter looked down at her with eyes the color of storm clouds, unreadable, unyielding. He wore a thick flannel shirt and suspenders over work-worn shoulders, his dark hair mussed as though he'd just come from the barn. "You're gonna freeze out there," he said flatly. His voice was deep, steady, and gave away nothing. Clara swallowed. Her throat, too, dry to form words. "Please, I just need a place until—" He didn't wait for her to finish. With a small grunt, he stepped aside, letting her in. Warmth hit her in a wave as she crossed the threshold. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting shadows over a simple but sturdy room. A worn couch, a shelf of books, a pair of boots drying by the wall. James shut the door firmly behind her, the sound shutting out the fury of the storm. He handed her a wool blanket from a nearby chair. "Sit by the fire," he said. "Get some heat back in you." She sank onto the hearth rug, drawing the blanket around her shaking frame. Her fingers tingled painfully as they thawed, and she bit her lip to keep from crying. The scent of burning pine filled the room warm and sharp, and for a moment she almost forgot where she was. James stood with his arms folded, watching her. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it wasn't exactly gentle either. "You can stay till the storm passes," he said at last. "But don't get ideas. It ain't love, just shelter." The words were blunt, and they hit harder than she expected. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. She understood the bargain. She was a stranger in a strange man's home, and this was a kindness she had no right to stretch beyond its limits. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, but inside, the fire's glow flickered between them, a fragile barrier between the cold and whatever else they both carried inside. The storm had not eased by morning. If anything, it had deepened into a white, howling wall beyond the frost-laced windows. Clara awoke to the smell of coffee and the low groan of the wind pressing against the cabin walls. For a moment, she lay still under the quilt James had tossed over her the night before, unsure whether she should even leave the small cot he had set up in the corner. James was already in the kitchen area when she rose, pouring himself a cup from the blackened pot hanging over the stove. He looked up only briefly as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Mornin'," he said, voice curt. "Storm's still bad. You'll be here a while." Clara nodded, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you." He raised a hand, cutting her off. "We'll keep to ourselves. You do what you need to stay warm and fed. I'll handle the rest." His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of a man used to solitude. "You can stay until the snow lets up. After that, you move on." She lowered her gaze. "I understand." The words tasted heavier than she expected. For the next hour, they moved around each other in quiet, almost like strangers in a train station, sharing space without sharing lives. James busied himself at the woodpile by the door, pulling on gloves before heading outside into the biting wind. Clara found her way to the small pantry, eyes scanning the sparse shelves until she spotted a sack of flour and a tin of salt. When James returned, dusted with snow, the scent of fresh biscuits was already filling the cabin. He paused in the doorway, his eyes flicking to the table where she was setting a chipped plate. "Didn't ask you to cook," he said. "I know," Clara replied softly. "It's just, I thought it might help warm the place." He said nothing, only set down the wood he'd brought and moved to stoke the fire. Yet when they sat to eat, he didn't complain, and though they ate in silence, she noticed the way he chewed slowly, almost as if savoring something he hadn't had in a long time. The rhythm of the day unfolded in this quiet, unspoken truce. He chopped wood. She swept the hearth. He fetched water from the pump. She washed the few dishes they used. There was no laughter, no long conversation, just a simple exchange of tasks. Still, every so often, she caught him glancing at her, quickly, as if he hadn't meant to look at all. Once, as she stirred a pot of stew for their supper, she caught him standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "You cook like you've done it for more than yourself," he said quietly. Her fingers tightened around the spoon. "I used to," she murmured, before quickly changing the subject. James didn't press her. In fact, he avoided asking much of anything, and Clara began to realize it wasn't indifference. It was caution. Whatever had shaped him had also taught him to keep walls high and gates locked. And yet, when she smiled faintly at something, the way the snow piled like whipped cream on the fence rails, or the rare shaft of light breaking through the clouds, she noticed his eyes soften, just for a second, before the steel returned. That night, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them felt different, not empty, but full of things neither dared to say. Somewhere beneath the howling wind and the creak of the wooden beams, Clara sensed the truth. He was just as alone as she was, and both of them, for their own reasons, were hiding wounds the other hadn't yet seen. The storm had finally broken, leaving the land glazed in white under a pale winter sun. The air was still sharp, but at least it no longer bit with the fury of the past few days. James had hitched up his horse early, muttering something about checking the fences, and Clara had taken a chance to step outside for a short walk around the property. The snow crunched under her boots, and her breath rose in faint clouds as she admired how the morning light painted the drifts in shades of silver and blue. What she didn't realize was that someone had seen her from the road, a figure in a long coat, scarf pulled up against the cold, heading toward town. And in small towns, the sight of a stranger, especially a woman alone, was enough to stir curiosity that could turn into gossip before noon. When James returned later that day, he hung up his coat without a word, but Clara noticed his jaw was set a little tighter than usual. Over supper, he mentioned it in passing. "Ran into Harlan Miller on my way back. Said he saw someone wandering around my place." Clara's spoon stilled halfway to her mouth. And nothing," James replied, but his tone carried a trace of irritation. "Folks around here like to talk. Don't give them a reason to." She nodded, though a knot of unease twisted in her stomach. The last thing she wanted was to be the subject of rumors, or worse, for James to regret letting her stay. "I don't mean to cause trouble," she said quietly. "You're not," he said after a pause. "But people will still find something to say. They always do." He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly, as if recalling a memory he'd rather forget. It was later, as they sat near the fire with the wind rattling faintly against the windows, that a fragment of his past slipped out. Clara had been mending a small tear in one of her gloves when she asked, almost without thinking, "Have you lived here all your life?" "Most of it," James replied, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Inherited the place after my folks passed. Was supposed to get married once, too." Clara looked up, surprised by the openness in his voice. "What happened?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "She didn't make it through the winter. Fever took her fast. That was a long time ago." His tone was steady, but the shadows in his eyes told her it was a wound that had never fully healed. Clara's fingers stilled on the needle. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words caught in her throat. She knew the kind of loss that made you afraid to let anyone close again. Instead, she murmured softly, "I'm sorry," and let the silence settle between them like a blanket. When James glanced at her, as if expecting her to share something of her own story, she looked away. "There's not much to tell," she said, forcing a small smile. "I've just been moving from place to place." It wasn't a lie, But it wasn't the whole truth either. For the rest of the evening, they spoke little. Yet in those few exchanged glances, his guarded but curious, hers hesitant but searching, something unspoken began to grow. Both carried secrets, and both seemed to sense the other's pain, even if neither dared to reach for it yet. Outside, the snow glittered in the moonlight, the quiet of the land broken only by the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Inside, the fire's glow flickered over two people who were still strangers, but maybe, just maybe, not for long. By the next morning, Clara had made up her mind. She couldn't just sit around while James worked himself to exhaustion keeping the ranch running. The snowstorm might have trapped her here, but she would not be a burden. When James returned from the barn, he found her already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, sweeping the floor with quick, determined strokes. "You don't have to do that," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "I know," she replied without looking up, "but I'm staying under your roof. I'll earn my keep." For the rest of the morning, Clara moved from room to room, dusting, mending loose hems, and keeping the fire fed. James watched her quietly, saying nothing, but the smallest hint of approval softened his usually stern features. She worked with practiced efficiency, like someone who had done this for years, someone who understood the quiet satisfaction of small, necessary tasks. When she tried to cook the midday meal, James raised an eyebrow. "If you're going to take over the kitchen, at least let me pay you back in supplies." Clara straightened, a wooden spoon in her hand. "No, I'm not doing this for payment. I'm doing it because I owe you for letting me stay." He grunted in response, not arguing further, though something about her stubbornness stirred a reluctant respect in him. Later that afternoon, James came in with snow on his boots and a frown on his face. The west side of the barn sagging under the weight of snow. "Needs fixing before it collapses." "I can help," Clara said immediately. He hesitated. "It's heavy work. I'm stronger than I look." Not long after, they were both out in the cold, working side by side. James pried loose warp boards while Clara fetched nails and held the lantern steady. At one point, a gust of wind sent a spray of snow over both of them, and Clara laughed, the sound breaking through the chill like a burst of sunlight. James glanced at her, startled by how it made the air feel warmer for a moment. When they finally stepped back from the barn, their breath misting in the fading light, James nodded. That should hold. Clara brushed sawdust from her gloves and gave him a faint smile. Teamwork. For a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them. Not attraction exactly, but a recognition of shared effort, of two people who knew what it was to keep things standing through harsh weather. He didn't say thank you, and she didn't expect him to. But that night, when she set his plate down at the table, he met her eyes and held them for just a second longer than usual. It was the smallest shift, but it was there, the beginning of respect, the first crack in the walls they had both built around themselves. The storm had begun to ease, but the cold still gripped the land like iron. James rode into town early that morning for supplies, his horse's breath rising in white plumes against the pale sky. The streets were quieter than usual, most folks still wary of the snow-packed roads. Inside the general store, the fire popped in the stove as the clerk, old Mr. Dugan, sorted tins on the shelf. James was paying for flour and lamp oil when Dugan leaned across the counter. "You got a woman up at your place, Carter?" James stiffened. "Why?" Fella came to skin around. Mean-looking sort. Said he's looking for a Clara. Claimed she ran off from his employ. Didn't like the way he said it. Dugan's gaze was sharp, a silent warning. Told him I hadn't seen her, but I reckon he'll be back. James felt a slow burn of irritation under his skin. He didn't like trouble, and he especially didn't like men who came sniffing around like they owned someone. Without another word, he gathered his supplies and rode hard for home. When he walked through the ranch house door, Clara was kneeling by the hearth, feeding the fire. She looked up, her cheeks flushed from the heat, and smiled faintly. The smile faded when she saw his expression. "Someone in town was asking about you," James said bluntly, setting the sacks on the table. Tall man. Hard eyes. "You know him." Clara froze, the poker still in her hand. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she placed the poker down carefully and straightened, her face pale. "Yes, his name's Russell Hayes." He was my employer. James weighted his jaw tight. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something she'd been holding back for too long. He tried to force me into marrying him. Said if I didn't, he'd make sure I couldn't find work anywhere else. When I refused, he got angry. I left before things got worse. James studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. And now he's looking to drag you back? She nodded. He thinks I owe him. But I'm not going back, James. I'd rather freeze in that storm than be under his thumb again. There was a long silence. The wind outside rattled the shutters, a lonely sound in the wide emptiness. Finally, James stepped closer, his voice low and steady. You're safe here. Clara met his gaze, something unspoken flickering in her eyes. Relief, maybe, or gratitude so deep it was almost painful. But before she could speak, James's tone shifted, a wall sliding back into place. Don't mistake this for something it's not. It ain't love, Clara, just shelter. She flinched just slightly, but covered it with a small nod. I understand. Still, that night, long after the lamps were out, James lay awake listening for hoofbeats in the dark. And in the next room, Clara sat by the fire, her hands trembling despite the warmth, knowing the storm outside had been nothing compared to the one that might be coming. The snow had hardened into icy crust by the next morning, and the air was so still that every sound carried far. Clara was mending a tear in James's coat by the window when she spotted movement on the horizon, a lone rider cutting across the whitened field. Something about the man's posture made her stomach knot. By the time the rider reached the yard, James had already stepped out onto the porch. The man dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. His eyes were as sharp as a hawk's, and his smile held no warmth. James Carter, he drawled, though the name sounded sour on his tongue. Name's Russell Hayes. I believe you got something of mine. James's stance didn't change, but his shoulders squared just slightly. Don't reckon I do. Russell's gaze slid past him to the doorway, where Clara now stood, her hands gripping the doorframe. There she is. Clara, you've had your fun. Time to come home. James moved before she could answer, planting himself between them. She ain't going anywhere with you. Russell's smirk deepened, but there was an ugly edge to it now. You think you can hide her? She's under contract. She owes me months of work, and I aim to collect. James took a single step forward, his voice low and cold. I don't care what you think she owes you. She's not property. You can turn your horse around and ride back the way you came. The tension stretched thin as wire. Russell's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed he might draw the revolver at his hip. But then, with a harsh laugh, he spat in the snow. This ain't over, Carter. You'll regret sticking your nose where it don't belong. He swung back into the saddle and yanked the reins. The horse bolted, carrying him toward the horizon until he was nothing but a black speck against the white. Clara's knees felt weak. She stepped forward, her breath shaking. You didn't have to do that for me. James turned, his face unreadable. Yeah, I did. Her eyes searched his, but before she could speak, he brushed past her into the house. For the rest of the day, James said little, his mind somewhere far off. When supper came, he barely touched his plate, muttering something about work needing doing in the barn. The sound of hammering echoed late into the night, steady and deliberate. Clara sat in the kitchen, listening to it with a strange mix of worry and curiosity. Whatever James was building out there in the cold, it was taking shape piece by piece, and she couldn't shake the feeling it had something to do with her. The storm outside had deepened overnight, snow piling against the windows until the light in the kitchen felt muted and gray. Clara rose early, planning to start the fire before James came in from the barn. But the house was strangely quiet. No creak of boots on the porch, no thud of wood in the storage bin. She followed the faint smell of fresh-cut pine down the hallway, stopping outside a door she'd never seen open before. A thin strip of light glowed from beneath it, and the rhythmic scrape of sandpaper reached her ears. Pushing the door gently, she peeked inside, her breath caught. The small bedroom, which she'd assumed was just a storage space, had been transformed. The walls had been dusted clean. A patched quilt lay neatly over a narrow bed, and near the window sat a half-finished wooden rocking chair. its curves smooth and warm in the morning light. James straightened from his work, caught mid-motion with the sandpaper still in his hands. For a moment, he looked like a man who'd been found with a secret he wasn't ready to share. Clara started, but her voice faltered. What is all this? He set the sandpaper down, rubbing the back of his neck. Figured the spare room was just collecting dust. Thought you might want a real place to stay. Something better than the couch. Her eyes drifted to the rocking chair. And that, James glanced at it briefly, then away. Seemed, homey, every room ought to have something you can sit in and look out the window. He hesitated before adding, especially in winter. The weight of his words sank in. No one had made something for her, not in years, maybe not ever. She stepped further inside, running her fingers over the smooth arm of the chair. The pine was warm from his hands, carrying the faint scent of sawdust and something gentler she couldn't name. You've been working on this every night, she said softly, remembering the late hammering she'd heard. He shrugged, looking anywhere but at her. Didn't figure it was a big thing. But to her it was... Clara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say thank you, to explain just how much this meant, but the words felt too small. Instead, she reached out and rested her hand lightly on his forearm. It's the kindest thing anyone's done for me in a long time. For a moment their eyes met, his guarded, hers open and unsteady, and the air between them felt warm despite the cold beyond the walls. James cleared his throat, stepping back toward the chair. It ain't finished yet. Give me another day, maybe two. Clara smiled faintly, but inside she knew the room was already more than finished. It was the first space in years where she felt she might belong. The wind outside howled against the windows, rattling the shutters in a steady rhythm. Inside, the ranch house felt cocooned in warmth, the fire and hearth casting golden light across the room. Clara sat curled on the couch with her knees drawn up, nursing a mug of tea. James was in his chair opposite her, boots stretched toward the fire, his hat resting on the table beside him. They'd eaten dinner in an unusual quiet, not the heavy silence of strangers, but something softer, as though both were circling the edge of a conversation they weren't sure they were ready to have. Clara's gaze lingered on the flames before she said, almost to herself, I used to love winter nights before. James looked at her from under his brow. Before what? She hesitated, then placed the mug down, her fingers twisting in her lap. Before I lost my parents. It was sudden. Fever took them both within a week. I was barely 19. The farm wasn't much, but it was home. I tried to hold on to it, but the debts, her voice cracked. I sold everything, piece by piece, until all I had left was a satchel and a place I didn't belong. James didn't move, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed the pull of her words. You've been on your own since then? She nodded. I worked wherever I could, kitchens, laundries, a boarding house for a while. That's how I met Mr. Riggins. Her eyes darkened at the name. He offered me steady work, then decided that meant I owed him more than labor. I left before he could take what he wanted. The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Guess it's my turn. Clara studied him, sensing the weight behind his tone. I was engaged once, he said, his voice low. Her name was Anna. We'd been promised since we were kids. She was good, too good for me. He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the fire. One winter, we were riding back from town. Ice on the riverbank gave way under her horse. I got her out, but she was soaked through in that cold. Fever set in quick. By the time the doctor got here, he stopped, jaw working. I should have saved her. Should have done more. Clara's breath caught. James, you can't. I can, he cut in, his voice sharper than he intended. Then softer, almost a whisper. I do, every day. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Clara wanted to cross the space between them, to tell him he wasn't the only one haunted by the past. Instead, she said quietly, we both lost more than we were ready to lose. Their eyes met across the glow of the fire, his shadowed with grief, hers shimmering with unshed tears. Something shifted in the room, something fragile but undeniable. James leaned back slightly, but his gaze didn't waver. "Clara," he began, and in the way he said her name, she heard the walls between them cracking. She rose slowly, drawn toward him as though the fire had moved into her chest. He stood too, almost without thinking, and for the first time they were close enough to feel each other's breath. The silence was electric. His hand lifted, fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She tilted her head up, her lips parting slightly. An unspoken invitation neither of them had dared before. For a heartbeat, the world outside disappeared. They leaned in, the warmth between them almost a touch, and then James pulled back, his brow furrowed. Clara stepped away too, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold in the moment. Neither spoke. The fire crackled on, but now it seemed louder than before, filling the space where words should have been. James cleared his throat. "We should get some rest. Early chores tomorrow." Clara nodded, retreating toward her room. But as she closed the door, she pressed her hand to her lips, feeling the ghost of something that hadn't quite happened, and wondering if, when the next moment came, they'd let it. The blizzard roared in from the north without warning, turning the ranch into a white blur. Snow piled against the windows, the wind screaming through the eaves like some restless spirit. For 3 days straight, they couldn't step outside without risking frostbite. The barn was unreachable, the path to town completely swallowed. Inside, they rationed wood and food, the world shrinking to the warm circle of light cast by the fire. The forced closeness was different this time. They moved around each other like a quiet dance, Clara stirring stew at the stove while James split kindling inside the entryway, their shoulders brushing as they passed in the narrow hall. In the evenings, they'd sit together in the living room, the fire crackling, silence stretching between them in a way that felt safe. By the fourth night, the storm still hadn't let up. James stood at the window, staring out at the swirling white. Clara was on the couch, mending one of his shirts by the dim lamplight. She watched him from a corner of her eye, wondering what thoughts were locked behind that unreadable expression. Without turning, he spoke. "You know, I can't picture this place without you anymore." Her needle paused mid-stitch. "That's not what you said before," she said softly. He turned to face her, his gaze steady but his voice low. "I know what I said." She set the shirt aside, a hint of mischief glimmering in her eyes. "I thought this wasn't love." For a moment, the only sound was a fire. Then James crossed the room in 2 slow steps, stopping right in front of her. "It wasn't supposed to be," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "But it is." Before she could answer, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It wasn't tentative or unsure. It was steady, certain, a kiss that left no doubt in either their minds. She felt the world tilt, her hands clutching the front of his shirt as though to anchor herself. The storm outside could have torn the roof clean off, and she wouldn't have noticed. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths mingling in the warm space between them. "Clara," he murmured, "I can't lose you." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Then don't." They stayed like that for a long moment, the firelight flickering across their faces. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside, something softer and stronger had taken root. The ranch no longer felt like a stop along the road. It felt like home. That night, as they sat together on the couch, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against him, they both knew the truth. Whatever storms might come next, whether from the skies or their own past, they'd face them together. The weeks after the blizzard passed in a blur of soft days and steady work. Snow melted from the eaves, revealing the muddy earth beneath. Life on the ranch returned to its quiet rhythm. But now, every chore, every meal, every sunset felt different. It wasn't just James's ranch anymore, and it wasn't just Clara passing through. It was theirs. Word traveled quickly through town, as it always did. By the time James rode in to collect supplies one crisp morning, folks were already giving him knowing smiles and Clara warm nods. He didn't bother correcting them when they spoke, as though the two were already bound for life, because in his heart they were. One clear afternoon, they stood together in the kitchen, sunlight pooling across the table. James leaned against the counter, watching Clara knead dough with practiced hands. "We could go to town for it," he said suddenly. She glanced up. "For what?" "For the vows." Or, his voice softened, almost shy. "We could do it here. Just us. Feels more like us that way." Her hand stilled, flour dusting her fingers. She searched his face, finding nothing but quiet certainty there. "Here," she said at last, her voice warm. "I'd like that." The wedding was as simple as the life they'd chosen together. A minister from town came out in a small sleigh, accompanied by the store clerk's wife, who insisted on bringing a cake. Their only other guests were the ranch hands from a neighboring spread, and Mrs. Whitlow, who'd been the first to bring Clara pie when she arrived. The ceremony took place in the front yard, the last patches of snow sparkling in the early spring sun. James wore his cleanest shirt, the one Clara had mended back in the storm. Clara wore a pale blue dress borrowed from Mrs. Whitlow's niece, the skirt brushing against her boots. They stood side by side, hands clasped, the minister's words simple but strong. When James kissed her, not the cautious warmth of their first kiss, but the steady devotion of a man who'd chosen his future, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh grass from the hills. After the small celebration, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The wooden rocking chair James had built for her sat in the corner, its smooth curves catching the light. She ran her hand over the armrest, imagining it years from now, the soft creak of it rocking as she held a sleeping child. James joined her there, his arm slipping around her waist. As the sun dipped low, they saddled the horses and rode out together, side by side. The land stretched endlessly before them, the horizon wide and bright. The air was crisp, the sky painted in gold and rose, and every hoofbeat seemed to echo the steady, unshakable rhythm of their joined lives. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already said. In the way his hand brushed hers on the reins, in the way her smile lingered when she looked at him. Ahead of them lay hard work, storms and years that would test them both. But they also knew there'd be laughter, shared burdens, and the warmth of home that had been built, piece by piece, from trust and care. As they rode into the distance, the ranch behind them and the promise of forever ahead, the sun broke fully over the ridge, flooding the valley with light. And for James and Clara, the journey, the real one, had only just begun.